She couldn't start it. She's starting now.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to session 4 of our webinar series, Beyond Collaboration. Our first session was about implementing ideas and follow through throughout the organization to achieve the total ideals. In the second, we explored business process management as the backbone of organizational success. And in our third, we focused on governance, risk and compliance and ethical leadership. In today's session, we are going to extend on that conversation as we talk about what some consider to be very foul language, audit management for sustainable compliance. I see we have in our audience guests from Sibanye, Eskom, Tongaat, Bidvest, and a whole host of audit consultants. Welcome, everybody. And as usual, we really do want to collaborate with you. So please feel free to enter questions on the right-hand side of your screen and participate in the polls as and when they come up, and we will share the results with you. I was just wondering, during this pandemic, how many of us have done internal audits on ourselves, just checking in to see where our own behavior or whether our own behavior matches the direction of the moral compass we set for ourselves. I'm going to introduce Dilli Naidu, CEO of Medalla and Associates. Dilli has always been very passionate about ethical leadership to the extent that he studies ancient civilizations to get a deep understanding of what makes people tick and what makes society in general successful. Dilli, over to you.
Thank you, Caroline, and greetings to all. This is probably one of the most important in our series of Beyond Collaboration, the auditing side, both internal as well as external auditings. And I'm sure you're all aware that based on the public media information, that auditing is an area that requires critical focus moving forward. So I've titled my presentation Beyond the Audit. My colleagues following me will be focusing more on the compliance and the audit side, but I just want to spend a few moments this morning setting the scene on what I call beyond the audit. So if we look at most leaders today, they are selected on their competence, their technical skills, and some of the accounting skills. People get from accountants to CFOs, become CEOs of companies, and that's what they've been trained on. But there are a number of other stakeholders in these organizations, including the members of the board, the shareholders or the key stakeholders and the executives. And there is no doubt from my personal observation that there is a need for positive accountability and, more importantly, a change in leadership behavior. And this is really what's going to change the future of how companies become sustainable and profitable while being socially responsible, by changing the actual behavior at the top, from the board level through the executive, through the operations, as well as people that are on the ground floor. So I've observed a number of scandals, both locally and internationally, over the past few years. And you'll see my title on this is headed as "He Who Pays the Piper Calls the Tune." And this to me is absolutely shocking, that both internal and external so-called neutral independent auditors have played to the tune of the piper. And you could see some of the companies that I've put on this particular presentation that is in the public domain, both in the public sector as well as the private sector. Some of you are on this call attending this morning, And you could understand the reputational damage that it's done to the brands of these organizations that have been painstakingly built over several decades. And single steps like lack of both internal as well as external auditing, proper auditing, has done reputational damage. And to rebuild that damage, and you could see, including some of the auditing companies that you're all familiar with, who are trying to do damage control and are trying to reinvent themselves. If we look at the government side, local government, there's approximately 300 local municipalities in South Africa today. And year in and year out, if you read the Auditor General's report, it's an absolute shocking, disgraceful announcement when you see almost a handful of those 300 local government and municipalities have actually passed the audit. Now, how do we stop this from continuing? And as I said previously, one is capability coupled with accountability and having the necessary tools in place that will allow you to do this audit almost in real time. And this is a sampling of many more examples. So in my view, South African business and government, some of them have actually fallen short. The codes and principles are only as good as their enforcement. In my personal opinion, I think that a number of executives, directors, board members have actually got away, literally, in inverted commas, with criminal offenses. And I think in South Africa, our authorities have been, in my personal opinion, extremely lenient vis-a-vis some of the other countries that I've seen around the world. So this is an area where profit has been placed above principle. So what my observation has been on the auditing side is that verification has been the norm versus actual detection. In other words, they take and verify what has been presented by the internal audit team of an organization, both in public sector or private sector. But there's no real detection rather than verification. So the analogy I use is being a guard dog as opposed to a bloodhound. So that needs to change both from an internal perspective as well as an external auditing perspective. So what are some of the principles of governance? And if we look at the 3 Ps, the people, planet, and prosperity, if we look at the purpose, the strategy, and the accountability, what are the measures that we put in place in terms of the risks and the ethical behavior in each of these areas? So how are you treating your people, your employees ethically? In terms of diversity, health and safety, what are the wage gaps? As far as the planet is concerned, there is no doubt globally and locally in terms of what is the impact on the natural environment, things like gas emissions, land protection, water use. Water, like electricity and power, is becoming a scarce resource. So how do we preserve that? From a prosperity perspective, how does the company affect the financial well-being of the community as far as employment of the community, the wealth creation, the taxes paid, and the research and development within those communities? So what is required is to start developing a common set of principles in the areas of what we call ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And this is for the good and prosperity of all. So this is largely now driven by outside forces that is not controlled by the company. So if you look at shareholders and investors, they are now very conscious of investing in companies where there is zero or no impact on the environment. Examples are in the energy power sector, where companies more and more are looking at reduction and investing where there's less carbon emissions, as one example. I have a few examples of some mining companies around the world and in South Africa. If you remember Lonmin, not so long ago, there were 34 miners that were killed. And if you look at the reputational damage that was done to Lonmin, the financial impact that it's had on their share price. Companies like Rio Tinto in Australia, where there was an outcry when there was lots of iron ore that was found, very valuable, worth hundreds of millions, but it was a 46,000 Aboriginal site. So the Australians stood up and put huge pressure on Rio Tinto not to go and mine in this particular area. So more and more you are seeing through social media and communities that there is huge pressure on ESG, the environment, social, and governance area. So what needs to be done? We need to agree future measures for sustainability. And from an auditing perspective, we need to report in a consistent way for business sustainability in the area of carbon disclosure. So in addition to your financial auditing, carbon disclosures, climate disclosures, global reporting, international integrated reporting, and sustainable accounting. And if we cannot save auditing, I believe we cannot save capitalism. And there will be something developing that will become market capitalism, that will be driven by the forces that I've mentioned, not just by the traditional company executives and shareholders and board holders. So with that, I would like to conclude my part of the presentation and introduce you to our next speaker, which is Mike Smith. Mike has been in business for some 45 years, both locally and globally. Mike is a business advisor at RSPH. He is passionate about compliance and regulations. In his personal time, Mike is a guitarist, and he also likes motorbikes, fast cars, and planes. With that, I hand you over to Mike.
Thanks, Dilly, and good morning, everyone. Just trying to find the little arrow that gets me onto my next slide. Caroline.
Mike, click on your presentation and then the next button at the bottom.
I'm not seeing a next button. Okay, did you do that for me?
Yes.
All right, okay. Then I'll have to ask you to go on to the next slides for me. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Dilly, and good morning, everyone. In our previous webinar, in which we talked about corporate governance, I began my presentation with a reference to the story of Cinderella and how her ugly sisters tried everything in their power to suppress Cinderella's efforts to overcome their selfish oppression. Well, Cinderella finally overcame their tyranny with the help of her Prince Charming, and, or so we are told, they all lived happily ever after. Well, actually, not quite, because suddenly they came face to face with this new thing called corporate compliance. So instead of a fairy story with a happy ending, we found ourselves faced with more of a horror movie featuring lots of monsters. So if you're scared by the concept of corporate compliance, you can leave the room now if you want. But if you like a bit of an adventure, then stay a while. For some, corporate compliance is not that complicated, and more often than not refers to a fairly limited number of areas. Next slide, please. And can be simplistically defined as, next slide, the way that a company ensures that it is following all the laws and regulations that apply to their business. So what does the law, next slide, have to say about how we should be running our companies? Well, excuse me. Unlike what some would have you believe, the law does not tell you how to run your company, nor does it directly provide a checklist of things you have to do to comply with the law. What it does do is, for example, It suggests, and here I quote, next slide, prosecutors consider the adequacy and effectiveness of the corporation's compliance program when investigating corporate wrongdoing, and that in doing so, 3 fundamental questions should be asked. Number 1, is the corporation's compliance program well designed? Number 2, is the program being applied earnestly and in good faith? In other words, is the program adequately resourced and empowered to function effectively? And number 3, does the corporation's compliance program work in practice? And in answering each of these 3 fundamental questions, prosecutors are further instructed to evaluate the company's performance on various topics that the criminal division has frequently found relevant in evaluating a corporate compliance program. The above statements are extracts from the United States Department of Justice document, Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs, published in June, or updated in June 2020. The document also goes on to refer to the following topics for consideration during such evaluation. Risk assessment, and that includes risk management processes, risk-tailored resource allocations, updates and revisions, and lessons learned. Policies and procedures, including design, comprehensiveness, accessibility, responsibility for operational integration, gatekeepers, and a whole lot more. Training and communication, including risk-based training, and the form, content, and effectiveness of training, communications about misconduct, and the availability of guidance. Confidential reporting structure, including the effectiveness of the reporting mechanism and investigation processes, including properly scoped investigations by qualified personnel, investigation responses, investigation resources, and tracking results. These are just a few of the many areas that the US Department of Justice is asked to consider in establishing the effectiveness of a corporate compliance program when investigating corporate wrongdoing, but they are not in themselves legal requirements. Similarly, the application and the principles contained in the King IV report are generally voluntary and are not in themselves legal requirements, unless specifically required by law in certain circumstances or by virtue, for example, of a stock exchange listing requirement. Either way, the organization is required to state which parts of the code it intends to apply according to the size and nature of its business, at which point it then becomes obligated to its stakeholders to do so, and then bound under common law to implement those parts of the code it undertook to abide by. But the law, however, is only one aspect of what compliance is all about. Most industries, especially those that trade in the international market, are subject to an ever-increasing variety of standards and regulations that they may be required to comply with if they wish to do business. Such standards and regulations are also typically not prescribed by law, but come about as a result of the type of product or service being provided, a national standard, a specific client or other stakeholder requirement, or generic international standards relating to quality, risk, safety, health, the environment, business continuity, energy management, anti-bribery, social responsibility, project management, service management, etc., etc. And then there are all those internal strategies, policies, business processes, procedures, and internal standards the organization says it follows. I did warn you that this story is about monsters, eh? Hang on a minute, I hear some of you say. What has what we do internally got to do with compliance with external standards? Well, compliance is not about doing the minimum required to get a compliance certificate for a particular standard. It is about actually implementing and executing the recommendations or guidelines of those standards. That is the doing. And this requires internal policy statements, documented strategies, business processes, adequate training, and sufficient resources needed to put those recommendations into effect. After all, the recommendations and guidelines contained in most standards are those which are generally acknowledged as being the sort of things that successful organizations choose to do in striving to be successful in business. That is stuff that is known to work. Most standards came about as a means of helping organizations to improve their operations and were based on what was already being done by successful organizations and could be used as a good example to others. It is also important to remember that the recommendations contained in most standards should not be taken verbatim, but should be understood and applied in the context of the client organization. And this is where I think a lot of so-called compliance experts, consultants, and auditors have got it wrong. How many compliance audits, for example, are conducting using third-party checklists or software that does not take into account the nature and size of the client organization? Given the much broader scope of the need for compliance beyond the usual certification requirements scenario, the big question is, how does one monitor, evaluate, and report on the strategies, policies, activities, and performance of a company in such a way that the fundamental questions regarding compliance can be answered objectively, and to be able to provide executives with not only the evidence of the extent to which their organization is compliant, but also the assurance that the organization has an effective system for identifying non-conformances, planning corrective actions, and following up to ensure that such corrective actions are not only implemented, but are successful in achieving the desired outcome. Wow, I need to take a breath here. That is a big question. But the answer is very simple, and I'm sure most of you will have guessed the answer by now. It is, of course, audits. I would like to make it clear, though, that I'm not referring to the once-a-year, drop-everything formal third-party audits that usually come too late to do any good anyway. And at this point, I have a couple of questions for you. I'm going to take a breath. Caroline is going to bring up some questions for you, and we'll have a look at your answers just now. Caroline, do we have some answers?
Mike, on our first, on the first poll, which asked if executives are ethical and accountable, 90% said yes. Actions to be taken against delinquent executive were 30% split between fined, blacklisted, and imprisoned. When asked if conventional auditing is doing enough, 100% of our guests said no. I'm pulling up the next question, which is auditing being used enough? Okay, on this one, we have 66% of the audience saying no, and 25% saying that if audit is used, it's being used poorly. I'm going to bring up the next question. Are auditors just doing enough to go through the motions to meet standard requirements? A 100% of our audience agrees with that one, Mike. And the last poll, do you see a disconnect between existing audit management and what is required for enterprise-wide compliance assurance? And we're on 66% agreeing and 33% saying no.
Thanks, Caroline, and thank you everybody for your contributions. So, if an organization is serious about compliance, then it should also want to receive assurance of such compliance on an ongoing basis. And that in turn requires audits be conducted in a regular, planned and organized fashion based on the needs of the organization itself, and not those as perceived by an arbitrary third party. So another big question, if we were to line up all of our compliance monsters, and let's assume that they include things like, and I'll take a deep breath again, safety, health, risk, quality, environment, HACCP, business continuity, CMMI, COBIT, COSO, balanced scorecard, energy management, financial management, Sarbanes-Oxley, King IV, anti-bribery, social responsibility, training, project management, service management, calibration, data security, and so on. I could go on for much longer. Point is, how on earth are we supposed to be able to manage and sustain compliance with so many seemingly disparate requirements and business needs? Is there a way of bringing all of these together in one place so that the extent of compliance throughout the entire organization can be measured and reported on an ongoing basis? Well, the good news is yes. Wow, at last some good news. And I will now hand you over to our next speaker, who will speak about how we go about sustaining compliance by streamlining audit management. Thank you, everybody, and over to you, Jesse.
Thank you, Mike. That was a good guideline on audit compliance. But what I'm going to suggest before we introduce Jesse, Caroline, if you could run that video, and then I will introduce Jesse.
Certainly, enjoy.
A lot of people don't know what's at stake during my job. They send me in to do the dirty work no one else wants to do. I'm an auditor.
Hey Rick, can you send those reports on Carla Bank?
They're not due till 5 o'clock.
5 p.m. Eastern time. That's 2 our time. You have 35 minutes to finish those reports.
Oh my God. Stop fucking around.
You have to do it. You need to do it. You don't want to test my patience.
Oh no. I had too much coffee. A lot of people don't know what's at stake during my job. They send me in to do the dirty work no one else wants to do. I'm an auditor.
Gotta go. Oh, that's great, but it was 3 seconds late.
What? No! The clock was off. The clock was off.
Your wife's dead.
No!
Your wife's dead.
No!
So auditing in some ways is time consuming, lots of pressure, and sometimes ungrateful, but somebody has to do it. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Jesse Hogan. Jesse is a native of Brazil, but more recently, Jesse has relocated to Liverpool in the UK, managing on behalf of SoftExpert Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Rifle Shot is a partner of SoftExpert. SoftExpert was created some 25 years ago, and a number of companies around the world, including auditing companies like Mazars in some parts of the world, have selected SoftExpert as their tool of choice. Other than Jesse's professional career, is also a musician and likes the outdoors. And Jesse is going to be sharing with you something that we call real-time auditing. So Jesse, over to you.
Thank you, Dilly. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, everyone, for the participation. And I'm going to talk about a real-time enterprise audit. So after the scenario that Mike has shown us and the video that Dilly has shown, it's kind of scary. Yeah, and now this compliance world, it's really a nightmare for all organizations, because you need to keep up with all new changing regulation. So this is not an easy work, and just highly on paperwork and human work, it's really difficult to have a audit to achieve its full objective. So I'm going to talk about this real-time enterprise audit using a platform we call SoftExpert Suite. The focus is going to be on the audit component. However, this is a very comprehensive platform. So that's the main target of this presentation, to show that if you have a system in place that can help you to not just have your guidelines or this requirements on paper or as a theory, but as a practicing, as a experience you have in your organization, where people are aware that these guidelines, this best practice, they are not just for shows up for a external auditor. It's also good practice to improve quality in every aspect of the organization. So in the audit, I'm going to talk more about internal audit, because I think that is the most important right now, because you first need to understand your internal requirements. So you need to get prepared. So you need to be aware of all the requirements that your organization should comply. So when we talk about internal audit cycle, I just want to highlight some of the main steps we have to consider when you do an internal audit. One of the very important things is perform process mapping, because one of the biggest problem is how we're going to identify the requirements, where they are, what area or department. So you need to have your processes in place. That's the first thing. If you don't have your processes in place, if you don't know your processes very well, so that's the first problem. So after you have your processes in place, so you know your processes, you're going to identify risks in your processes. So those risks, they are in every activity in your processes, so you need to identify them. Then after you identify the risk, you have to set controls on the activities. So you have to control those risks, defining controls, making checklists to ensure that people are aware and they follow all the steps. You have to bring together the process, the evidence of your content, your audit. You have to record your non-conformities, and you have to set action plans. These two parts are very, very important, because here you start to do your audit. So you start to find the non-conformities, the deviation in your processes or in your controls you define when you identify the risks. And this is a cycle. So after you do this, what you have your findings, your non-conformities, you define action plans, and you have to keep monitoring all the actions. So this is a cycle. So identify risk, define controls for the risk, make checklists, evidence, start our internal audit, get the non-conformities internally, action plans, and monitor. This is a cycle. So normally this is audit, action plans, implement change, and follow up. That's the cycle of audit, and this has to be a continuous thing. So that's why you need to have a platform where you have access to your processes. So one first thing here is this platform is able to map the processes, and not just map processes, but processes integrated with risk. This little bomb here, that icon, means that when you map the process, you also identify the risks in your process. And when you find the risk in that specific activity, on that specific process, here I'm going to be very generic. The risk might be a compliance related to Sarbanes-Oxley, or a compliance related to environmental issues. So here you can understand any type of risk. So when you have your process in place, you can easily pinpoint where you might find or you might have a risk. And when you define that risk, you might set controls when it's possible. So that's where audit comes. Now I'm talking about auditing a process where I have a risk and I set a control. So what I should audit? I should audit that control that is related to a risk. Okay, so this is one scenario, so you can understand part of this process. So first, set your process, or put your process in place, identify the risk in your process, and define controls when possible for those risks. Okay, the controls, you can imagine many different things. So depending on the type of risk, the compliance you need to comply. So the controls, they should vary from like a inspection or a web search that you read some information in a database to check any change. So this can be different types of controls, and some of them you can fully automate and some of them you cannot automate. But the most important thing, now you have the visibility. So when you start to plan your audit, you go to your processes and you start to find the controls you need to audit. This is a little portal that our system allows you to have, so you can see the processes, the risk you have in your process, and the controls you have it. So you can drill down this information very easy. So you have the purchase process, communication, and many different types of process. You can create a portal where you can see the risks, or the number of risks in every process, and the controls you have. So it's make your audit easy. On the risk identification side, you're going to define your risk library, And for every risk that you can set a control, you're going to define a control, and you're going to define a test for that control. And you can audit the test for that control to see if it's really effective or not, or if it's passed on the test or it fails on the test. So you can audit the test. Here I'm talking about audit integrated with risk management, integrated process management. So you can have a clear picture. So I define my process, I identify risk. On every risk, I define controls. And now this integration between audit and risk enables me to audit my controls directly on the risk component. So one of the biggest problems to perform an audit is to bring together all the documentation, all the paperwork I need to analyze. I sometimes have to go to different systems, get different reports to substantialize my audit. In this case, I'm talking about a system that you have process. You can map your process integrated risk, so you can identify the risk directly on your process. And then when you go to your audit, you can do audit over controls that I define for my risks. So now I have an audit that goes straight to the point, and I have an effective way to get to do what is very significant for me in terms of risk, in terms of audit, and what kind of compliance risk I have, and what controls I have defined, and how I'm going to audit those controls. Again, this is a single platform. You can buy have just the audit component, but you can have the whole platform. So this is the risk component, just a few slides just to have an idea what you can do from risk management side. And we have a component called requirement. That is a crucial component because, as Mike has said, there is a whole world of compliances that every organization should comply. So you need to get organized. You need to map requirements. So this system, the requirement component, allows you to map all requirements. So you can create your library of requirements. So here you're going to define, like Sarbanes-Oxley, this is a type of requirement. So you have all the requirements from Sarbanes-Oxley. And when you define every requirement, you can set general configuration, the name, ID, the guidance number, the reference, and the document. You can track this external link to that specific compliance. And here it's very important to have in mind that you have to be aware of changes on those requirements. So you need to have a system in place that can help you to keep up with this every changing world when it comes to compliance. So here you have on this system a way to notify people when this regulation has changed. So you just set a type of notification. So every year, or every month, or every period of time, you can define when that a specific requirement has changed, so you can take actions when it changes. When you define your requirements, so that's the library, that's a generic thing. I'm not talking about a specific record. So you just create your library of requirements. So every compliance you define in your library. So if it is ISO, if it is a SOX, or any type of compliance you need to comply with, you're going to set in your library. So then you're going to map those requirements on processes or wherever they can appear. So what business area or what department or what system it is in place that have to comply with that requirement. So now you have the library, you have already those requirements. And when you map them, so after you have them in library, you're going to map them on departments, on systems, so you know where that requirement or is, it have to comply with, or what type of system or department or activity you have that you have to comply with this specific requirement. And then you have this requirements, and you can configure if it's applicable to that specific department, and if it's implemented, or if it's partially implemented or fully implemented. So this list of requirements, shows the applicability of that requirement on that specific area, the implemented measures, and here you can see this little yellow light bulb, and this icon here means in this requirement I have an action plan in place. If I click on that icon, I can see the action plan. I have also a control for that specific requirement. If I click on that icon, I can see the control that is related to a risk. This little bomb here means there is a risk related to that specific requirement. And here, I mean, there is a incident related to that specific requirement. If I click here, I can follow up the whole incident, and I can track all the full traceability over that incident. So as you can see, in a single screen, you can have requirement related to a specific compliance, the applicability of that requirement, the implemented, if it's implemented or not, if there is action plans related to it, if I have a control and risk and incident connected or linked to that specific requirement. So that is a requirement component that is tight integrated with the audit component. So in other words, first you have your process in place, identify risks. But when you talk about identifying risk, you need to be aware what type of risk. So you have to get back to requirements. On the requirements, you're going to understand what type of requirements you need to comply. So you have your library. So you're going to associate that specific requirement to that risk. If you don't have this single integrated platform, I can ask you, how you're going to do that? If you have like different silos, different systems to do this, it's really a nightmare because you don't have that integration. Here you have the compliance you have to comply with, where you're going to have to comply, or what type of activities or place I have to comply with, what type of risk I have connected to that requirement. If there is an incident or a problem, I can relate it to that specific requirement. And I have action plans in place where I can follow up and monitor on real time what is going on related to that specific requirement. So that's why we call real-time audit, because this is a live process. So I'm just looking at some different perspective of that system. Now I'm looking at the requirements itself as a library of requirement as a whole, but I can go to audit and see them as audit requirements, not as a global thing inside of an organization. So now I have a list of all requirements, and then I go to audit and I can set those requirements as a requirement for my audit. So here, one part of my job as auditor, we need to communicate people. So the system allows you to find portals where you can see the requirements in a list. So these are online. These portals are shareable. If you click, you can share the portal. You can give permissions to people to access this portal. You can just set permission over specific frames. So you don't need to show all the portal, but you can show just part of the portal according to the permission you set. And you can share the link, and people click on the link, and you can see the information you allow them to see. But here I just define all the requirements and implemented. So you can see the total percentage of the implementation, or it's not implemented yet. I can see the number of, in this case, I'm talking about SOX, so it's the number of application required, 27. So the percentage of implemented requirements, so I can see that's 58%. And all those charts, they are clickable. So if you click, you can drill down on this information to get more details. Then when you start your audit, first thing, you cannot do this in just one go. You need to plan. You need to have an annual audit program, not just a project, but a program. So as you can see here, this is a projected audit. What I mean, this is a project tool where you can create audit as a project. In this sense, I'm using a program that is, every lane on this image here is a project. If I click here, it's going to expand and show the Gantt chart for that type, for that specific audit. So here I have all my audits during the year. And I can see the Gantt chart from those audits, so I can compare actual and planned. And it's a project management solution integrated with audit. So I can use just the audit component standalone, or I can use project integrate with the audit. So I can use the project to do my audit planning, activity by activity, defining audit or defining audit, defining scope, using project or using the standalone audit. But that's very important. This is a program where every audit here is a project. So I can see the annual calendar, the annual Gantt chart from the whole audit I want to perform during the year. So I can have my different scopes, so ISO 9000, SOX, or any type of compliance that I'm going to perform during the year. So in this sense, I'm prepared. I have everything in place, and you can just recycle, you reuse that the next year. So you don't have to prepare all over again. So when you have a system in place, you can follow and see those change on real time. You can see the progress of your audit on real time. This, if I click on one of those lanes, I can get, this is a project of that audit. So here I can see the finished parts of my, or finished activity of my audit project. Those that I finished late, the red ones, the ones that are still being executed, so it's 54% executed, this 100% are finished. So I can, and those didn't start yet, so I can have a clear picture of the progress from my audit. And here I'm showing the audit over control. So this is audit, so I have my requirements for the audit. So I'm audit my risk plan, and here I have the controls I need to audit, and I can do a test of samples to define if the control was effective or not. So I have passed, failed, and passed. So I can do audit over controls. So this is one thing. So now I'm showing a integration when I say the scope of that audit is a risk audit. So when I'm going to start my audit, I'm going to select my risk plan that I already have defined. On that risk plan, every risk might have a control. So if it does have a control, I can audit the control if they're good or bad. So if you don't have this set of tools, maybe you have a risk solution, maybe you have a audit software, but they are not integrated. So we have to go manually. You have to go to your risk and do the test, and go to your audit and put the results there. Here you have the integrated thing, so you don't need to do so. Just go select the requirement, and down here you're going to see the test, so you can perform the test and see if they fail or passed on that test. And you have the whole evidence here on that specific risk. What is important here as well? See, this is occurrence. So if you see occurrence, you just can click here and you start an occurrence related to a specific item. So now I start to see the CAPA thing, the corrective and preventive action, integrated with risk, integrated with audit, integrated with project, integrated with process. So that's why I say real time, because everything is connected and you can see the progress in real time. And now I'm doing audit over a risk. I can use just do a regular audit over some compliances requirement, but I have everything at hand. It's easy to create my audit, to have my evidence, because they are all in a single place. And when I create the results, everything is transparent, is visible. I have all this visibility and on real time. So when you do audit control, you can see the progress. So you can see just this a different overview of that audit over controls or risk controls. So you can see the progress and the results. This is a easy way to see the progress of your audit over controls. So when you take actions, you can get actions over regulatory requirements, over risk, over controls, over operational loss, or over a regular audit non-conformity. You have action plans available for all those different areas. So you can have action plans related to risk, to controls that are connected to risk, to operational loss, or to a specific requirement of a non-conformity in a process that's not related to a risk, but is a non-conformity. And the system you can define the plan of that action plan, the execution, and you can, in the end, evaluate the effectiveness of that action plan. Remember, I'm not talking about different things or different systems that we have to collect information from one side to another and try to create integrity. No, this is natively integrated. So you go to your audit and see all the action plans that are related to your specific audit. So you just type the title of the audit or the idea of that specific audit, and you want to see all the action plans that are related to that audit. So you select a specific requirement, and when you select it, you show, oh, there is an action plan in place. So you can follow up, you can see the execution and the effectiveness of that specific action plan related to that specific non-conformity or control or risk. And then you have those online reports where you can always track your action plan. So you can see the responsible for the action plans. You can see the action under implementation, action deadlines, action plan progress. All those are clickable, so you can explore and drill down this information into that chart. And this chart is alive, so it's real time. So if a new action plan is under execution, so this number you change, you see more here. So every change that is in progress, you'll be updated on real time on that portal that you can share. Again, you can make it public, or you can share with the specific groups or positions. So now you have information visibility, easy access to report, real-time report. Again, here you have your all these results where you can check the percentage of compliance related to a specific requirement. All these results where you can drill down to a specific audit. You can click and go to that audit and see requirement by requirement, see the whole thing just clicking by this portal that you have online. Well, I hope that is a lot of information, but this is the Soft Expert platform. Dilly?
Thank you, Jesse, for touching on some key functionalities and capabilities of Soft Expert Audit. The key things that I picked up was, other than the audit side, but was real time, being able to get things in real time, and the integration to other applications like risk. So just to recap, we touched on a few things. I covered what I called beyond the audit, which was around the competence with accountability and changing behaviors. I talked about the principles of governance, which was the 3 Ps, the people, planet, and the prospects. We talked about ESG, which was the environmental, social, and governance, and how we create a common set of principles to manage that. And then we talked about sustainability and putting a common set of measures for sustainability. Mike covered a number of guidelines around the compliance side of things, and of course, the tool that was shared with you. With that, we would like to thank all our presenters this morning. But more importantly, we would like to thank you for making the time to attend this morning's session. We trust that you've benefited from this. This was just to whet your appetite. Obviously, we could not do full justice. So we look forward to continuing this discussion with yourself as you move on improving your audit journey. So we look forward to the next presentations with yourselves. With that, I would like to thank Caroline for putting this together and the marketing team at RSPH. Bye-bye and stay safe.